when a fully grown tiger began to pace up and down the Indian military gates for several days, military personnel became concerned. Why was he there? What did the tiger possibly want? The commander had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, so he took charge. And this happened. Every day, at varying times of the day, the tiger would appear slightly at the fence with a slow growl. It would slowly pace up and down, clearly wanting the military's attention. The men of the camp didn't know what to think, even though they were trained for combat. A fight with a tiger was not exactly on the same page. Amongst the men were some that had had unpleasant dealings with tigers in their home villages. Some began to think that the tiger was in search of food, pacing the fence, looking for a way in. The fear grew in the camp. Men weren't able to sleep at night knowing what was out in the jungle beyond their fence. The commander decided to reach out to a local zoologist in the nearby city. The zoologist was very surprised to be contacted by the military. He was in fear that perhaps he had done something wrong. Still, he agreed to travel out to the military base, thinking that they needed his help, although assisting the military was not something he thought to be in his job description. Anyway, since he was patriotic, he agreed to assist where he could. He had no idea what was waiting for him. Entering the military compound, the zoologist could smell the fear on the soldiers. Something clearly wasn't right. He was escorted to the commander's quarters where he was briefed on their problem. A fully grown tiger pacing a military fence. The zoologist couldn't really believe what he was hearing. This was very unusual behavior for such a complex feline. Naturally, he was instantly intrigued and agreed to assist where he could. So, with the help of the brave soldiers, the zoologist began to log the tiger's movements. What time of day he would skulk out of the dense Indian jungle, the types of growls that were emitted while he brushed up against the fence. The zoologist spent 2 days observing the apex predator and came to a daring conclusion. He visited the commander in his quarters again and explained that it was in his findings that the tiger was attempting to get their attention and was, in fact, not a threat. So the commander's feelings were right. The zoologist requested a few hours to concoct a plan to solve the problem, and off he went. The commander waited patiently, and when the sun just began to hide behind the trees again, the zoologist announced his plan. He requested that a group of the bravest and fittest soldiers accompany him to track the tiger. Now, at first, the commander was not convinced. He was concerned about risking the lives of his soldiers based on the opinion of a scientist. However, when the word spread across the camp that the zoologist was looking for a group of men, many soon began to volunteer. It was of their opinion that if tracking the predator was the only way to get the tiger to move away from the camp, they had to help. And so, the commander agreed. The zoologist explained the risks of what they were about to embark upon. The men were in agreement that they would obey his instructions and offer protection where necessary. The zoologist impressed the importance of remaining calm if they were to follow the tiger successfully into the dense and lush jungle beyond them. So when dawn began to approach, the group of men sat and waited. They were armed with their rifles and supplies to last them for a few days. It was only when the sun peeked up in the sky that the tiger came skulking out of the jungle. In his routine manner, he came up to the fence and began his ritual of pacing up and down. The low growl instilled fear into the group of soldiers, but the zoologist pacified them. After about an hour of this, the tiger turned back toward the jungle. It was now that the group of men had to embark on their dangerous mission. Keeping a safe distance from the predator, the zoologists and soldiers began to stalk the striped cat. The muggy humidity assaulted the soldiers as they ventured deeper and deeper into the dense jungle. At times, the tiger would stop and turn to look at the group, almost as if to check that they were still following him. However, when night fell, the tiger disappeared. With no other option, the soldiers warily set up camp, each taking turns to watch out for any threats. When the sun rose the next day, the tiger was nowhere to be seen. Defeated, the group started wondering if the zoologist had been wrong, thinking that, in fact, the tiger had been luring them out into his hunting grounds. However, the zoologist kept his composure and reassured the men that he was a good tracker. So the zoologist began to look for tracks, and soon enough found them. The group then followed the tiger tracks. They just kept going. After 3 hours, they stopped, and they could hear something loud. They broke through the jungle edge to find a roaring river with the recent monsoon rains. It made sense that the river was rushing like it was. The zoologist became concerned because the tracks stopped at the river. This meant that the tiger had swum across. But why? He knew tigers were strong swimmers, but with a rushing river like this, it made no sense why the tiger would risk its life like that. It was then that one of the soldiers shouted in excitement, "There he is!" Just a bit up the river was their orange and white striped friend. The tiger stood near some rocky terrain that seemed to have been disturbed by the flooding water. So the group worked their way up the riverbank, trying to find a safe spot to cross. They found a shallow, rocky trail that led its way to where the tiger stood. Slowly they advanced, one behind the other. The closer they got, the further up the river the tiger went. Once the zoologist got to the other side, he was determined to follow the retreating tiger, only to be called back by the soldiers. Now at first he ignored them, only to be screamed at until he turned around. The soldiers were gesturing towards the rubble of rock that lay where the tiger stood before. 2 of the men began to unload the rocks that lay on the pile. When the zoologist got back, the soldiers explained that they had heard cries from beneath the stones. So as a group, they all worked together to try and see what lay below the debris. When one of the soldiers managed to pull up one of the last stuck rocks, it opened up to a hollow below. The zoologist pointed his flashlight into the dark abyss, to be met by 4 eyes. It then occurred to him that it was the tiger's cubs trapped beneath. He told the soldiers to quickly remove all the other rocks, and sure enough, there were 2 little tiger cubs sitting in what appeared to be a cave-like formation. It all started to make sense. The tiger was not male, but in fact female. She must have left her cubs in the makeshift den when hunting, only to return to it caved in from the flooding river. After the rush of extra water, it had left a pile of rubble entrapping the cubs. Now, dried up, they would cry from their prison for their mother. With no way of getting them out, she had resorted to getting help from the 2-legged creatures camped a few hours away. They finally understood what she had needed: help. The group pulled the cubs out of the hollow and placed them gently on the ground, safely away from the rush of the river. They heard a high-pitched moan from upriver and realized that the mother tiger could see her cubs and was anxious to get to them. So they retreated back across the river as they had come. They waited patiently, just out of sight, to see the reunion between the mother and her cubs. It was a sight the men never thought they would see. The mother ran down to her cubs and immediately began to nudge and groom them. This whole time, her little cubs had been starving and calling for their mother. Seeing the tiger happy and the cubs safe, the soldiers took their leave, making their way back to camp feeling quite triumphant. Upon returning, the commander was so pleased to hear that his instinct had been right. The tiger had come to them for help, not to threaten them. It proved that humans and wild animals still had some sort of connection. He proceeded to thank the zoologist, and so the camp celebrated their victory in assisting their new friend. One could argue that the tiger saw the good in the soldiers. She knew that somehow, in some way, they would be kind enough to help her.